Can you introduce yourself and share who you are and where you're from?
I'm Kailia Star, Mimi to Olivia. I moved around a lot of my life, so I can't really say where I'm from. Was born in California, Orange, California, Southern California, and lived there for my first 7 years. And then we moved, of all places, to India. And I lived in India for 5 years. And we lived in a neighborhood with other Indians. We didn't live kind of separated in the American commissary. My parents sent me to an Indian school, and they didn't speak English, so I learned to speak Hindi and Urdu, which is another Sanskrit language. So I learned to speak fluently. I could go anywhere in the country and speak to anybody, and that was cool and that was fun. And in India, they have wild dogs that are wandering all over the place, and I used to feed them. I'd go out into the back alley where we lived, and I'd bring them food. And one day, I was taking a bit of food from one of the plates and putting it to give to another dog, and that dog bit me. And of course, these are stray dogs, so rabies is like, I had to get rabies shots. So they give you, in those days, they give you 12 or 14 shots. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. And so my mom didn't like that I was doing that, but I felt so bad for these dogs. They were hungry and we had extra food, we could feed them. I just still continued to feed them, just a little bit quieter. So when I was a really little kid, I used to literally lie awake at night and I would wonder what happens to us when we die. And one day in India, I was walking with our ayah, which is like a nanny. It was a public street, and in India they have their bodies get cremated. So and the cremations sometimes happen out there in the public. And she explained to me the person had died and their body was being cremated, and the idea is that then their spirit lifts up out of the body and goes to God, the spirit. And all of a sudden, something clicked in my mind. I was like, oh, something with that just totally made sense to me. And so from there, I, began, I think, much more kind of really being curious about my spiritual life. And it's always been a focus. I was 13, and in 1968, things were really exploding here in this country. Big time. There was big civil rights. There was the Vietnam War was happening. So I just wanted to get involved in all of that, and I felt like I came back with this whole different perspective. I was sort of different than most of the other kids I was going to school with. So it was a weird place to move back from being in this multicultural out of the country to this little town in Massachusetts. We only lived here for a couple of years, and then we moved to the Washington, D.C. area, and that was much better because then we were around all kinds of people. And I was a teenager, and I was a rebel, and I was I was out there marching against Vietnam War at 14, 13, and really kind of on the edge of what was expected and culturally normal, and my parents kind of didn't know what to do with me. So I felt like I came back, and I always felt like I had this different perspective than everyone else did, which is true, I did. I didn't like school, so I wasn't really, there wasn't much I was interested in school at the time, and I ended up leaving when I was 15. I just left school, and so then I left home and moved out to Virginia. Yeah.
Tell me more about Virginia.
Well, so Virginia, I was in a band before I moved out there, and we had a gig. I was a singer in a band, and we had a gig out in Virginia somewhere, and I was amazed to see how these people were living. They were all living in, they were living in communities, in communes, in group houses, and I just thought that was really cool. And I just happened to mention to this woman, I said, wow, it must be really cool to live out here. I was just, And so before, like a week later or something, when I came back home, she called me and she said, we found you a place to live. And I was like, okay. And then I went. So it was really very spontaneous. I was already living away out of my parents' house and living with a friend. And so I just went. 6 months to a year or so before I met your mom's father. So, out there we lived in community. There were people who were moving out from the cities, what they would call now counterculture. We were against the life that was happening in the cities, definitely against the wars that were going on. We learned how to grow our own food. We played music. We danced. We did art. A lot of us were artists. We swam in these beautiful lakes and rivers. We had babies when I got pregnant with your mom. And then we moved for a bit of time out to Northern California and Oregon. We lived in this fabulous community where all these artists had lived, like a huge community of 200 people had lived there in the 60s. And we lived there for about 6 months. And I moved back out to Virginia, to the mountains. Well, I was a single mom with your mom until she was 9 years old. That's when I met Papa. When I moved here to Massachusetts, it was a little harder because it was a lot on me, and it was much more expensive to live here. So it was tough. I had to take care of her and pay for everything on my own. But one of the best parts of it is I didn't have somebody who I had to check everything out with. It was just me. It was all up to me. So there was the stress of that, but there was also the ease of that. Didn't have to run it by anybody. Well, as I was going through the photos, I was remembering you, since of course you were the first one. I loved bringing you out into the garden, showing you the things that you could eat out of the ground. I remember showing you Johnny Jump Ups. It was one of your first things, and you were like, oh, you can eat those? I was like, yes, you can eat those. I think what I'm most proud of is that I've always greeted life and people with my heart, and always have, I think of myself as a very open-minded person, and so I always love to see who this person is who I'm with, or who this tree is when I'm out in nature. I've always kind of greeted life with optimism. I think I've always been an optimist, and with goodwill. And I think that's probably, I guess that's one of the things I'm most proud of.
Gorgeous. That's perfect. We're perfect.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a good spot to end with. Huh?
I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good?